what we're going to cover in this hour was probably the single most amazing thing for me to learn when I began learning apologetics. That is, understanding what God says is going on inside the heart and mind of every unbeliever. I always assumed that before I could talk to someone about Christ, I had to prove that God exists, and that seemed like an impossible thing to do. Therefore, it discouraged me from sharing the good news of Jesus. But Romans chapter 1, if you turn there, Romans chapter 1 gives us a different picture. This is God's eye view of what's true of every unbeliever in their heart and mind. So think about those in your life that don't know Christ. God says this is the truth about their heart and mind. As you're turning there, just to mention a few things. If you have any questions about the books in the back, I'd be happy to answer them. There's some good books on speaking to Muslims. Two of them are by Nabil Qureshi. If you know who Nabil Qureshi is, he's a man who came to Christ through his college roommate. He was training to be a medical doctor. His roommate was a Christian, and over 3 or 4 years, shared the gospel with him. He got saved. He grew up in a Pakistani Muslim family. His book there, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, is a powerful testimony of how he wrestled with giving up Islam, because that was his family's religion, and converting to Christ. And so he did, became an apologist, and then in his early 30s, about 6 or 7 years ago, died of stomach cancer. Left behind a wife and several small children, or one small child. And really heartbreaking that God took him, but powerful, powerful book. There's several books on sexuality, transgenderism, what the Bible says about homosexuality, and a small book there called Making All Things New, which is about healing from sexual sin. So there's some great opportunities there. If those can be a help to you, I hope that they will. Let's look at Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18. I'd heard this passage taught on many times growing up. And yet, when I heard it taught in apologetics, I saw things I never saw before. So Romans 1:18 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. That is, God has revealed to every person on earth that he is a holy God, that he is angry at sin, and that people will stand before him in judgment. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them. Why? Because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived. Think about that. God's invisible nature is clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they, that is every unbeliever, are without excuse. And here it is again in verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So this passage opened up so much for me to understand what God says about the unbeliever. First of all, it says in this passage, every unbeliever already knows God exists and knows some things about him. In other words, God says here, in the way the world has been made, not just nature, but the way the world functions, the way that people mourn when they lose someone that they love, the way that people have a desire to produce things of beauty and lasting value. Everything about the world points to a designer, a creator, who is morally and ethically holy. And everyone, this passage says, is well aware that they're guilty before God. So when I talk to an unbeliever, they may say something like, prove God exists to me, but I know that they already know God. Now, they don't know him in a relationship of grace. They've never been forgiven for their sins. We would say that they know God in a relationship of wrath. They're well aware, this passage says, that God's wrath abides on them. Therefore, they're aware of their guilt. Now, they can sear their conscience. They can make it so they don't feel bad about sin in their hearts, but when confronted with sin, they cannot escape the fact that they've done wrong. So notice a few things about this first point. Every person is made in the image of God. That is, part of them knowing God is that they're made in God's image. If you were to meet my son somewhere over the next week or so after listening to me for hours and hours, you wouldn't even have to see him. All you'd have to do is hear his voice, and you know that's got to be Mark Farnham's son, because the poor guy is cursed with my identical voice and even looks like me. And you know what this is like if you have children or grandchildren that look like their parents. And if that kid were to say, I don't know who this is, then you know that they're denying something that they know to be true, because the image is unmistakable. So God says every unbeliever, because they're made in the image of God, they're made to reflect God's glory, they can deny all they want that they believe in God, but they do know that he exists, and they do know some things about him. Every person then has the implanted knowledge of God. All through this passage 5 times it says they know, right down to the last verse. Although they know these things make them worthy of death, they not only do them, but delight in those who do them. That is, when you're dealing with an unbeliever, you're dealing with someone who knows the holiness of God and they know their sin. They don't know Jesus. That's what the gospel, the scriptures had to be written to give them that. But because God has implanted that knowledge, they cannot really deny it and be convincing. So notice the holy nature of God and his wrath against sin, as we're told in this passage, is clear, plain, and well known. So one of the things I'm going to do, we'll talk about this tomorrow, is I'm going to bring up the moral question. Do you believe that in right and wrong? If so, what makes something right? What makes something wrong? In the Christian worldview, right and wrong are determined by the character of God and the commands of God. So I have something stable that's rooted in the dignity and respect of the holiness of God, whereas any other system of morals is going to be inherently inconsistent. So for example, take someone who believes in evolution. There's no designer. It's a blind process of time and chance, and you are just an accident of nature. That is the standard view of evolutionary atheism. You're an accident of nature. You are a ghost driving a meat skeleton. That's all you are. And then they turn right around and say, and we should be kind to one another. We should treat one another with love and empathy. Well, those are a contradiction. If you're an accident of nature, I should have no concern for you because I'm an accident of nature too. Why should I care about another accident of nature? So only the Christian worldview can point to these things in a way that makes sense. So this knowledge, then we're told at the end of verse 20, so they are without excuse, makes the unbeliever without excuse before God. That is, no one will stand on Judgment Day and say, I didn't know. We're told in Acts chapter 17 and Romans 2 that God has written eternity on people's hearts. Even in Acts 17, the most religious society of the day, the Greeks. Remember, Paul goes to Athens and there's statues and temples everywhere. Everything was connected with a god. You go to get a drink of water, you thank the god of water for that. You go to get healing, you go to the temple of Asclepius, and you pay money to buy a clay model of your leg if your leg was a problem, or your kidney if your kidney was a problem, and you would offer the temple of Asclepius and pray for healing. Every aspect of society was religious. And Paul goes and he says, let me tell you the unknown God. You even have a monument to him. And the truth is you know it, but you've rejected it. So let me put it before you. That's really important. That made me realize if someone says, prove God exists to me, I really don't have to because that's an impossible demand. This person knows it. Now what I want to do is find out specifically what objections do they have and what do they think the real God, the true God is like. If someone says, well, I could never believe in a God who just arbitrarily, kills people and smashes people and doesn't care at all. Well, I don't believe in a God like that either. That's not the God of the Bible. Can I show you what God has said about himself in the Bible? Or if someone says, prove God exists to me, I'll often say, what would it take to prove God exists to you? And many times people will say, that's a good question. I'm not sure what it would take. Some people would say, well, I want God to appear before me and do some miraculous work. Oh, okay. And what would he look like that would convince you that he's true, that he's real? Bright light? Would that be enough? Well, no, not really, because I could be having a hallucination or an aneurysm or something like that. So what would God look like, and what would he say to you? What could he do that would Prove that he exists to you. And I have an acquaintance in Lancaster who is the founder of the local Free Thought Society, the atheist group. And one day he admitted in class, because at the end of every semester at the college, when I teach apologetics, I invite him into class. I let him give his best case for atheism. Then I let the students go, let them off their leashes. Go get them. And one of them asked him, so what would it take to prove God exists to you? And he said, to be honest, there's nothing you could do or say, nothing you could show me that would ever prove God. It's not a problem here, it's a problem here. So if someone says, prove God exists to me, I say, what does it take? And many times they would say, well, I would want him to appear in such a way that I know he was real, tangible, and to do some kind of miracle that I know was God. And I say, I'm so glad that you said that. Let's go to the Gospels and see where God did exactly that. That God comes down in the person of his Son, and for 33 years, he lives on earth. He can be handled, he can be touched, as John says in 1 John 1, and he does all these miracles. What do you know about Jesus? And we move from an impossible demand, God, prove God exists to me, to write, have you ever thought about Jesus? Have you ever read what he said? It totally dismantles that argument. Because I know this person is well aware of their guilt. They're well aware that God is holy. What does it mean to live without an excuse? Well, I love this cartoon. Patient says to the doctor, I have metal fillings in my teeth. My refrigerator magnets keep pulling me into the kitchen. That's why I can't lose weight. All right? Not a great excuse. Well, God says the unbeliever doesn't have an excuse for their sin either. So then what do you do with people that say, no, I don't believe in God at all? Well, we're told in this passage that every unbeliever suppresses the knowledge of God in an attempt to escape the accountability. I look for a picture that was suppressing, and this is a person trying to suppress a sneeze. You know what happens? You feel a sneeze coming on, you might rub your nose. I don't know, maybe you have some other trick to try to stop it. Well, to suppress means to push down or hold back that which is rising to the surface. God says, think about this. Think of the unbelievers in your life. God says every day this person, because he lives in God's world, think about this. This is God's world, right? Because they're made in the image of God, and God's revelation is inescapable. Every day, every unbeliever you know is actively doing this. Trying to push down, trying to hold that beach ball underwater. And what happens when you try to hold a ball underwater? It comes to the top always. It's irrepressible. So the unbelievers you meet, sometimes they do a good job of holding that down. You're talking about spiritual things, they have no interest. But I know this, is that that person actively is working hard to not face the reality that they're guilty before a holy God. Other people are tired of trying to push it down. You try to share the gospel with them, they explode in anger. Or they get mad and they get antagonistic. Why? Because you're pulling their hands back and that knowledge of God is rising up in them. And so they're mad at you. Keep your religion to yourself. Don't you talk to me about Jesus again. So when I talk to someone, one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how are they suppressing this knowledge of God? Because they can't do it always and forever. It's kind of like when you're going through your day, you feel great, feel fine, all of a sudden your stomach goes blur, and you feel a little wave of nausea, and you think, that's odd, I wonder where that came from. Then you're okay for a little while, and a few minutes later, the waves of nausea begin, right? You caught a stomach bug or something. And what are you doing as that's increasing in intensity? You're holding it down. I'm not going there. Not going to the porcelain Honda. I'm not going to present my offering at the gods. I'm going to hold it down. You're trying to push it down, and that thing just comes up. Well, that's what God says the unbeliever's doing every day. And they do this a number of different ways. This is not in your notes, but very quickly, some people turn to religion. Why? Because religion gives the semblance that I'm dealing with my sin. Every religion has this idea that I've done wrong, and the gods or the God needs an offering. This is even true in atheism. What is the offering in atheism? I must give my mind and my reason to unbelief in God, and I will present that offering by not believing anything that doesn't make sense to me. So some people turn to religion. And why do you think they do that? Because every religion in the world except Christianity says you can do something. You can do something that will either earn you favor with the God, or if there's a faith that has no gods, like Buddhism, you can work toward enlightenment. You can do something. And Christianity says you can do nothing. You have to stand before a holy God empty-handed, hopeless and helpless, and admit to God, I am guilty and I deserve your wrath. That's too terrifying. And so people, where do all religions arise from? In the history of humankind, religions arise as people think of ways that we can earn our favor to the gods or the goddesses. And we will invent gods and goddesses mostly connected to nature, because that's where the power lies that we can't control. And we can do things. We can offer a lamb. We can offer a human sacrifice. We can offer the first fruits of our fields, and then the gods will pay us back. And Christianity says you can do nothing. You have to admit to a holy God that you're guilty. But here's the twist. Every other religion in the world operates in such a way you can never know in this lifetime what will happen to you when you die. You can never have assurance. I was just telling the ladies down front that when I was sharing the gospel in the mosque with this young Muslim man a few years ago, the imam came up and I said, what's the state of a Muslim? He said, every day, every Muslim is climbing a rope to Allah by his good works. And Allah dangles that rope over hell. And at any moment, he can let you go into hell. He said, you could be a good Muslim all your life, observant, devout, do one wrong thing, and Allah sends you to hell. Or you could be a bad Muslim all your life, not observe anything, do one good work, and he welcomes you into paradise. Completely arbitrary, completely capricious. And that's why religion has such a grip on people, because they think, I must do, I must do, I must do. Christianity says you can do nothing, and that's the terrifying part. But the gospel says Christ did for you what you cannot do for yourself. And therefore, all you can do is cast yourself on his mercy by repenting of your sin and believing in him, and you can have assurance in this lifetime. But some people, not wanting to admit that God is holy and they are guilty, they turn to another religion. For some people, it's distractions. Why do you think technology has such a great hold on Western society, around the entire world? Well, there's lots of reasons. One of my interests is studying technology and its impact on us. But it's so that I don't have to face reality, right? I can be in my phone, on my computer, on TV all day long. And as long as that's playing, I can tune out the rest of the world. And for some people you meet, the hard thing is getting them to consider God because they're too focused on their technology. This comes from a video game my son was playing, and he told me about the banner there. It's from the video game BioShock. No gods or kings, only man. And a lot of the atheism, a lot of the skepticism today exalts us. We are gods, and technology and its message is a man-centered one, very appealing. It's why people are addicted to gaming. Now, there's nothing wrong with video gaming in and of itself. I play a little video games myself once in a while. But for many people, that's their entire world. And there have been young people who have died playing video games because they refuse to get up and eat or drink or use the bathroom or anything else. Why? Because I can enter a different reality. And if you've been paying attention to Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, you know about the metaverse and about Meta, where he wants to create a second reality where people can go. There's a movie out called Ready Player One that's all about people who live in a video game. The outside world is falling apart, but their whole life is in that game. It's one of the ways people suppress the truth. For some people, it's addiction. Again, these are not your blanks here, so if you wrote them in, you're going to have to get a sheet of paper afterward. Why do people become alcoholics? Why do they kill themselves with drugs and food and sex and entertainment and thrills and money? It's because that dulls the pain of knowing I will stand before a holy God. That's at the root of it. There's many other reasons. Is I don't want to have to face what I've done or what's been done to me. But notice, none of these things can help a person escape God. Douglas Coupland, who is a New Age author, says this: my secret is that I need God, that I'm sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I can no longer seem to be capable of giving, to help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness, to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. In other words, as an unbeliever, he recognizes, I've tried to do all this in my own strength, and I can't. I can't. So now we get back to our blanks here. So what does suppression lead to? In the text, we're told, as the unbeliever suppresses, he exchanges things. In just a moment, we'll see that. But notice one of the results of suppression, you deceive yourself. So notice the picture. The fat man is looking in the mirror. What does he see? Trim, muscular, his younger self. That's self-deception. George Orwell, the author of 1984, says we are all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue. And then, when we are finally proved wrong, impudently twisting the facts so as to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against solid reality, usually on a battlefield. That is, I can live in self-deception, but someday something real is going to hit me, and I won't be able to deny it anymore. Secondly, suppression leads to irrationality. You begin to say and do things that are clearly irrational. Thomas Nagel, professor of law and philosophy at New York University, says, I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. Notice that phrase, I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Well, folks, that's irrational. As a scientist, he should want to discover reality and accept it for whatever it is. But it shows you, and this is a recurring theme here, a lot of apologetics tells you the problem is here. People don't know the facts, so give them the facts. That's partially true, but at the heart of it is the heart. People don't want there to be a holy God to whom they're accountable. And so all the intellectual objections are a smokescreen for the real issue. It's like when I talk to people and they have all these intellectual objections and I answer them and they say, well, I don't care if you can answer them. I just don't want to stop living with my girlfriend. Now we've gotten to the heart issue. I don't want God telling me what to do with my body, with my sexuality. It's really not an intellectual argument at all. Now that's not true of everyone, but quite often that's the case. Albert Leninger, who is the author of the biochemistry textbook used in most colleges today. At the very end of the textbook, I had a scientist come up to me after a conference one time, so you got to look at what it says. This massive book, brilliant biochemistry, the last couple pages. There's yet no satisfactory model or theory for the origin of the genetic code. We don't know where it started. Indeed, Francis Crick and Orgel have pointed out that it is not beyond reasonable possibility that genes in the genetic code may have been brought to Earth by, anybody want to take a guess what this brilliant scientist posited as a possibility for how it all began? Aliens, spaceship, from some other body in the universe where intelligent life had already evolved. Of course, this idea is no answer to the problem, since one must then explain how life arose elsewhere. Why would a brilliant man say something like this? Because in suppressing the truth, he's become irrational. And thirdly, suppression leads to idolatry. That is, I will put something else in the place of God. And every person is an idolater if they haven't turned to Christ. Even as Christians, we have to fight idols in our lives. The last verse of 1 John 5:13, John says, little children, keep yourself from idols. John Calvin says the heart is a factory of idols. That is, there are always things popping up in my heart that I seek to love more than God. That's what it means to have an idol. That I find my identity in. That if I lost, I would feel like life is not worth living. So even as Christians, I can take good things and make them idols in my life. And I have to always say, Lord, open hands. You want to take my health, my home, my family, my job. I love those things. They're good gifts from you. I appreciate them. But I love you more, God. Isn't that a hard struggle? But the unbeliever is steeped in, enslaved in idolatry. David Foster Wallace was an up-and-coming American novelist. Many said he was the next great American novelist. But he was an atheist, lifelong atheist, and in 2005 he gave a commencement address. You can find it online and watch it at Kenyon College. And as an atheist, he said this: there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. If you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. Worship power, and you'll always end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. This is brilliant. It's so true. Anything we place in the place of God in our lives, and we love it more than anything else, and it shapes who we are, it will be inadequate. Only God can fill that role in our lives and hearts. So when I talk to an unbeliever, I know that they're worshiping something other than God. So in my conversation, which we'll talk about tomorrow morning, one of the things I'm trying to find out is what is most important to you? Where do you get your sense of significance in life? Because whatever it is, that is your God, that is your idol, and you worship it. And I want to show you that only by worshiping Jesus Christ can you ever find the hope and satisfaction that you're trying to get out of this other thing. So notice then exchanges. Idolatry is maintained by a series of exchanges. Beginning in verse 23. Verse 22 says, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Because, number two, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. And then in verse 26, women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. So three changes that happened. First of all, the real for the fake. About 15 years ago, I went to China. And the seminary where I was teaching, where Josh went to school, we were opening up an outreach to pastors in China that never had training in the Bible. We had done that for 10 or 15 years in Romania and then in Russia. I took a number of trips to Russia and Ukraine back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Pastors that had suffered under communism but never had training in the Bible. So in 2003, 2004, as China was opening up, they said, let's send someone to go make a connection with the underground church there and see if we can provide training for them, because they have no training either. So they picked the tallest person that they knew and said, let's send him to China under the guise of visiting a friend there, and let's have him meet with the underground church. Brilliant plan. I remember my first day in China, I'm sitting in a taxi cab, so I wasn't even standing up, and I'm in a city in the eastern coast of China, and I'm sitting in the taxi cab, and a bus pulls up next to me. And this guy is in the bus is crowded, he looks down. He starts doing this on the bus. In other words, the city where I was, there were so few Westerners that he was amazed. And all the people in the bus are craning their heads to look at the guy in the taxi cab at the light next to me. So the leader said, we've got a brilliant plan. We're going to drop you off in this part of the city. And there's a French market there. Go in, just wander around a little while. And then, if no one's watching, then cross the street, go into this apartment building, go up to the third floor, turn left, don't knock the first door, just open it up and go in. There'll be Chinese Christians waiting to hear your teaching. So I walk into the French market and every eye turns and looks. Who is the giant? And so it was a failed plan from the beginning. But it was a wonderful opportunity to meet Christians who had suffered and to train them. But while I was there, I bought a Rolex watch. It's amazing. In China, they're only $20. I don't know why. They're so expensive here. It was beautiful. It was chrome, just gorgeous. And I came home from my trip. Everyone's like, Mark, that's a gorgeous watch. I know, it's a Rolex. You should see. And it was great for a few weeks until I got some water on it. And within a few minutes, the glass fogged up. Took it off, slept overnight, got up in the morning, and the minute hand was floating in water in the bottom of the watch. Why? Because it wasn't real. But for all outward appearances, it looked real. And God says what the unbeliever does, instead of worshiping the true God, he takes something that's a counterfeit, something that has some explanatory power. You take every religion that's ever stuck, the ancient Greek and Roman, Canaanite, Babylonian, Egyptian gods. Why did people believe them? Well, because they had some explanatory power. Why do we have hail in the middle of harvest? Well, the god of sky, Baal, must be upset. So let's offer sacrifices to Baal so he'll give us fertility. And they'd offer sacrifices, and the next year, perfect crops. Well, Baal must be in charge of that. In other words, that's how people develop this idea of worshiping other things. And God says instead of believing and worshiping the true God, they take the fake. They also, we're told, exchange the truth of God for a lie. And they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator who's blessed forever. Amen. In other words, people take created things and they worship them. Money, success, popularity, power, or nature. You know, the rise of earth religions, Wicca and Hinduism and other things like that are growing in the West. Why? Because people find it easier. Why would you want to worship a God of nature, a God of power? Because he doesn't demand anything of you. You can live the way you want to. You just got to offer a sacrifice once in a while. And so they'd rather believe a lie than to tell the truth. And thirdly, we're told they exchange, in verse 26, this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passion, shameful desires, for the women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. That is, God designed men and women. We'll talk about this tomorrow. God designed men and women to be different, to be distinct from one another, but to be compatible and to be able to reproduce. Their bodies are complementary. Their emotions and their personalities are complementary. God made that, but part of this suppression of the truth is people saying, we don't want God's design, we will do it the way we want to. And at the heart of the LGBTQ movement is a rejection of God's design that says we don't believe the body was created for any intent, no design or purpose, therefore we can use it the way we want to. That's at the heart of it. And God's not saying here then that homosexuality is the worst sin, but he's saying it's the most obvious violation of what should be plain to people, what should be clear to people. And notice then, on the next page, page 5, the more an unbeliever exchanges the truth for a lie, the more God gives him over to spiritual blindness. And the unbeliever's suppression of the truth is part of a complex system of belief called a worldview. So everyone you meet has a worldview. There's a wonderful little book back there. I should have grabbed a copy. It's called Telling a Better Story. You want to hold that one up, honey? Dark green cover or blue, depending on what color spectrum you follow. Telling a Better Story. In that book, the author makes a wonderful case to say until you understand the story by which a person lives, you'll not know where to go to address their rejection of the Christian faith. Take someone who believes in evolution. The world came about through random process of time and chance. There's no design, and it's only through mutations, random mutations with no mind behind it, that things have evolved into what they are. Well, if that's your worldview, then you have to explain a number of things that the evolutionary worldview can't explain, such as why should we care about other people? Why shouldn't I care only about those who are genetically connected to me? Why do I mourn when bad things happen and people die? See, in the evolutionary worldview, the world is exactly the way it's supposed to be. The fittest are surviving and the weak are dying out. Therefore, when something bad happens, all the evolutionists should clap and say, you go, natural selection. But they don't. Why? Because that's not really how the world works. We were made by God for a different world. We were not made for death. Death is unnatural. We were made for a world in which there was nothing but blessing. So when someone that we love dies or suffers, we grieve and mourn. That has no evolutionary function. It shouldn't happen. It does happen because we're made in the image of God, and there's a part of us that knows this is not the way the world's supposed to be. And only the Christian faith can say this is not the way the world is supposed to be. And by the way, God is going to fix it someday. That's a radically different worldview. And notice then what a worldview is. It is a fundamental orientation of the heart. That's so important. A worldview is intellectual, but at the heart of it, it is a heart issue. As Thomas Nagel says, I don't want the world to be that way. It's a fundamental commitment of the heart that we hold about the basic constitution of reality. What is this world? What is the purpose of life? Where are we going? Why am I here? In the evolutionary worldview, there are no good answers for those. You're here because you're a reproduction of your parents' genes, and your goal is to survive and pass those on. But beyond that, you have no inherent function because there is no design. You weren't created by anyone. You didn't have a purpose or a telos. Which is why those who embrace that worldview and hold it consistently, like Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, or Albert Camus. Albert Camus says in the opening line of one of his books, the only real question left is the question of suicide. Why? Because if there is no God, if we're not made for anything, and when we die, that's it, why not end this life as soon as possible? So in talking to someone, I'm trying to figure out, who do they think they are? What do they think the world is? What do they think is wrong with the world? Here's the wonderful truth. Only the Christian worldview can consistently answer those things. Intellectually, logically, and only emotionally satisfactorily can it answer those things. Tim Keller's book back there, Reason for God, it's a white book. He dives deep into that, saying, listen, let's take all the other beliefs in the world and let's hold up human experience and ask the question, which other belief system can answer these to our satisfaction? And he says, none of them can answer them except for the Christian faith that is rooted in the eternally existing triune God who makes this world for his glory, makes us in his image, and when we fall into sin, gives him of himself in the person of his Son to save us and is guaranteed a glorious end. That makes sense of everything. As we'll talk about Sunday morning, that makes sense of evil and suffering. It makes sense of why people die when they shouldn't. What do you say to someone who loses their 9th child to miscarriage? What do you say to someone like me who gets end-stage renal disease at 38, kidney transplant at 43, brain tumor at 52, cancer a few weeks later? Like, you're going to give me the explanation that this is just the way the world is? Then why do I want so badly for it not to be? The only explanation is, as Paul says in Romans 8, the whole creation is groaning for redemption. That makes sense. Oh, and by the way, there's hope, because Jesus suffered what I deserved, so I would never have to deserve that. I would never have to receive that. So this is what God says goes on in the heart and mind of every unbeliever. Tomorrow, I'm going to do shorter sessions, and I'm going to have opportunities for questions. So please, bring questions. I will field a question on any topic. That doesn't mean I'll be able to answer every question you ask, but I'm willing to take any question you might ask about a religion, about problem of evil and suffering, about the Bible, about whatever it might be. But bring your questions, and let me throw another challenge out there to you. One of the things I love to do is do dialogues in front of a crowd. So if you would be willing to come up and play the part of an unbeliever, pick a character, say, I'm a pantheist and I believe God is everywhere and in everything. And you'd be willing to come up and play that role, and I will show you, here's how I would talk to someone like that. Or someone who's an atheist, says, I don't believe in God, I believe science has all the answers. If you can channel that person, and I've won several local and regional Emmys channeling unbelievers, not really, but my students say I deserve them. Because if we understand the unbeliever's worldview, then we know how to go about it. So if you are up to that task, let me know. I'd be glad to do that. But let me pray, and I will release you. Notice your clock. It's 9 o'clock. That's good. Let's pray.